The fleet dropped out of hyperspace like a fist opening in the darkness. One moment, there was nothing above the blue planet. In the next, 43 ships hung in orbit. Battle cruisers the length of small cities, landing transports packed with soldiers who had not yet been needed. 3 command ships, so massive they warped the light around their edges. They appeared simultaneously in perfect formation, blotting out a section of the stars just as a hand covers a candle flame. Fleet Commander Zerkvel led from the forward observation deck of the flagship, looking down. He had done this 43 times before. The planet was blue-green, swathed in clouds, with a single pale moon tucked to the side like a faithful dog. On the dark side, he could see the lights of cities, small orange clusters scattered across the surface, warm and quiet. He had looked down at such lights before. From above, they always looked the same, warm, alive, unsuspecting. He gave them 6 hours. 6 hours was the standard. Enough time for them to look up, count the ships, and realize the nature of what was happening. Enough time for anyone who considered themselves a leader on this planet to make the calculation. The calculation was always simple. The calculation always worked. In 43 campaigns, he had never seen a civilization find a way out of it. He went to his quarters and read the dossier on the species. They called themselves humans. 1 planet, 1 moon. No colonies, save for a small orbital station housing a maximum of 6 people at once, no faster than light travel. Their weapon technologies lagged behind the Veil standard by roughly 200 years, which meant they were impressive by their own metrics and inconsequential by his. They had managed to split their own atom, which most civilizations eventually do, and they had built weapons around it. The dossier noted that they had quite a lot of such weapons. More than seems necessary for 1 planet, the analyst had written in a small note at the bottom. Then, it seemed, it had become necessary for a single planet. Zerkvel read this, then moved on. He had seen nuclear weapons before. He had seen what they could do on the ground. From orbit, they posed no concern. He finished the dossier and returned to the forward observation deck. His communications officer turned away from her console. She looked slightly puzzled. "Commander," she said, "terms? No terms. They want a direct channel." She paused. They responded in 40 minutes. He looked at her. No civilization had ever responded in 40 minutes. 6 hours was the standard because 6 hours was what it took for the shock to become reality. 40 minutes is not shock, he mused. 40 minutes is not acceptance. He did not know what 40 minutes were, but it was not like anything he was accustomed to. "Open the channel," he said. They were placed in a white room, a table, 2 chairs, nothing on the walls. A room that said nothing about the people who created it. They were either very smart or very reckless. His holographic image was projected on their side. On his side, he saw her clearly. The human was a woman, not young. Her hair was graying at the temples and cut short. She wore a military uniform without any rank insignia, no medals, no badges that he could read. Just simple fabric. Commanders of her apparent rank wore their history on their chests. She had nothing. She sat with a straight back, her hands flat on the table, and before her lay a printed copy of the terms of submission delivered by his fleet. She was reading them, not pretending to read, but actually reading. Her eyes moved line by line down the page. In her right hand, she held a pen, a simple one, the kind used for making marks on paper, and she was writing in the margins. Zerkvel waited. She turned the page, wrote something, turned another page. In 43 campaigns, no one had ever made him wait while they made notes on their own terms of surrender. Some cried, some spoke without stopping, some sat in silence because silence was the only thing left. No one had ever treated this moment as a document to be reviewed. She turned the last page, read it, and set the pen down. She looked at him. Her eyes were brown, very calm. The eyes of someone who had already made a decision and was now just dealing with the next steps. "I have read your terms," she said. Her name, he had been told, was General Amara Oi. She commanded what they called their defense council. "They are standard," Zerkvel said. "Not subject to negotiation." She nodded once. Not as a sign of agreement. It was an acknowledgement, as if he had confirmed something she already knew. "Full political control of the planet passes to the Veil Dominion," she said, not reading from the document, just reciting the terms from memory. 40% of our annual resource output becomes tribute. Our military is disbanded. Our leaders serve in an advisory capacity without actual power." She paused. And Clause 14 states that any organized resistance after signing is punishable by the destruction of a civilian population center. That is correct. She fell silent. She looked at the document one more time, then looked at him. The pen was still in her fingers. He saw that it was chewed at the top, where one holds a pen in their mouth when deep in thought. The chew marks were old. The pen had been chewed many times over many months of long meetings. She put it down. "We respectfully decline," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Do you understand what that means?" he asked. "Yes. You have seen the fleet above your planet." "Yes. Then you understand what comes next." "Yes," she said. Her voice did not change. Her hands did not move. She sat just as she had when he first saw her, looking at him the way a person looks at a thing they have already accounted for. "I suppose so." He chose a coastal city on the edge of the big ocean. It had about 1.5 million people. He chose it because it was large enough to be understood and far enough from the capital that the government would survive the lesson. That was the point of the lesson. The government had to survive it. They had to feel what it was like to lose before they decided not to lose. The bombardment lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, the city was simply gone. No ruins, no fire. Vanished. A crater had formed where the buildings stood, and steam rose from the ocean where the water had surged in. And a silence hung over the planet, the kind he had heard before. In 12 other campaigns, it was a silence that sounded like a civilization counting its own dead and understanding arithmetic for the first time. He had done this twice before. Both times the channel opened within an hour. Both times the first word across the channel was surrender. He waited for the channel to open. It did not open. He waited 1 hour. He waited 2. His communications officer kept checking the array, looking at him with a small furrow between her brows. The channel did not open. Instead, 3 hours after the bombardment, data arrived. His long-range sensors picked up signals from the planet's surface. Coordinated movement, not civilians fleeing from something. It was not the chaos of a population in shock, but organized, deliberate, simultaneous movement across 6 separate landmasses. His tactical officer began marking the signals on the display and fell silent, which she did when what she was seeing did not fit into any category for which she had a name. Commander. He walked to the display. He looked at what she was looking at. Power signatures were activating across the entire planet. Non-civilian hospitals, government buildings, various facilities that were clearly built for a specific purpose and had been waiting for a long time, waiting for exactly this. His tactical officer was young. She had been through 6 campaigns. She was good at her job. She stared at the display as if she didn't know what she was seeing. "They are mobilizing," she said. He stood at the display and watched the signals. Zerkvel, who over a long career had become very good at reading the contours of military situations, parsed the data. He looked at the spread of activation points, the speed of coordination, the simultaneity across 6 continents, as if the signal to begin had been sent and received everywhere at once, as if they had been waiting for the signal for a long time, as if they knew the signal would come. He opened the dossier again. 1 planet, 1 moon, no hyperlight. Primitive by all the standards his civilization used. He read the note about nuclear weapons again, more than seems necessary for 1 planet. He thought about the general. He thought about the 40 minutes. He thought about the pen with the chewed top and the notes in the margins and how she had looked at him when she said, "We respectfully decline." Not like a person who had just rejected something, but like a person who had already moved on to the next step. She knew what would happen after she said, "No." She sat there and said it anyway. He thought about what one writes in the margins of their own terms of surrender. What is important enough to write down in 40 minutes? What does a person note when reading a document that is supposed to end them? He did not know. His communications officer spoke from the other side of the room. Her voice sounded very careful. "Commander, they are not opening the channel." He did not answer. He looked at the city lights on the dark side of the planet, still burning. 1.5 million of those lights had just gone out, but the rest were still burning. And under those lights, whatever this species was, they were moving. They weren't sending messages. They weren't asking for more time. They weren't doing any of the things that all other civilizations had done at this moment. They were doing something else. "Give me their full military history," he said. His voice sounded very flat. "Everything we have." His tactical officer turned to her console. She opened the records. She looked at the results for a long time without speaking. Then she turned. "Commander," she said, "how far back do you want me to go?" He looked at the planet again. Outside, the stars were very still and very far away. "To the end," he said. His intelligence officer, a young analyst named Sarek, spent the rest of that night reading. She sat in her cabin, surrounded by data on screens, and read without stopping. She read about a species that had been in organized conflict with itself for over 10,000 years without a break. She read about wars that had taken the lives of hundreds of millions of their own kind, not as a result of accidents, not from disease, but intentionally in campaigns they had planned and conducted against each other. She read about weapons they had built specifically for killing each other in newer and more complete ways. She read that at any moment in their documented history, some part of this species was at war with some other part. They had a word veteran for a person who had already been through a war and decided to return to another one. The word was spoken with respect. Sarek sat in her cabin with screens full of data and a cold cup of something that she had forgotten to drink. And she looked at the word and what it meant, and she sat with it for a long time. She was still sitting with it when the sun rose over the planet below. She opened a new file on her console. She named it simply Anomalies. She did not sleep. Sarek presented her first report 10 days after the fleet's arrival. She stood in the briefing room before Zerkvel and his senior officers, data on the large display behind her, and was calm and steady for the first 3 minutes. She went through the basics: planet size, population, resource volume, structure of their governments. She used her careful, analytical voice. She kept her hands still. Then she moved to history. This species has been in continuous armed conflict with itself for approximately 10,000 years, she said. There is not a single period in their documented history, not a single decade, where some part of the population has not been actively at war with another part. She let that settle for a moment. For comparison, she said, the Veil finished their last internal conflict 800 years before our first expansionist campaign. The Galactic Council average for the completion of internal wars among its member species is 600 years before their first contact with another civilization. She looked around the room. Humans never stopped. She switched to the next slide. Their weapon development reflects this. They have dedicated more of their industrial and scientific resources to weapon design than any other single area, including food production, medicine, or infrastructure. Currently, they possess enough nuclear weaponry to destroy the surface of their planet several times over. There was silence in the room. "Several times?" asked one of the senior officers. "Several times," Sarek confirmed. The most common explanation in their own historical texts is that having enough to destroy the world once was considered insufficient. There had to be enough to be certain. She went through everything: wars, weapons, the industrial potential they could repurpose for killing when they needed to, how their history showed time and again a species facing extinction that responded not with surrender, but with rebuilding and returning. She showed records of wars where they had lost millions in a single battle and kept fighting for years afterward. She showed the term they used in their military culture: no surrender, she said carefully, not as a boast, but as a philosophy. When she finished, a silence hung in the room. Zerkvel looked at the data on the display for a long time. Then he looked at Sarek. "Your assessment," he said. She had not slept for 30 hours. Under her eyes were dark circles, which in her species appeared as a slight bluish tinge to the skin. She looked at her commander and said what she had been trying to formulate for 10 days. "We shouldn't have done this," she said. The first real engagement occurred 3 weeks after the fleet arrived. Zerkvel sent his third echelon combat group to fight the human defense fleet that had assembled in the upper atmosphere. The third echelon was more than enough. He had used the third echelon to break the last 4 civilizations he had encountered. The third echelon is not even his best. The third echelon is what you send when the outcome is already decided and you just need someone to make it official. The fight lasted 11 hours. It should have lasted 2. The human ships were older, smaller, they were not as fast and not as well armored. And in a direct engagement, none of that mattered. The Veil combat group was larger in every meaningful aspect, but the humans did not fight in a straight line. They fought in ways for which there were no names in the Veil tactical manual, because the manual was written by people who assumed the other side would try to survive the battle. Humans were trying to win it, and that is different. And the difference was costly. 3 human ships, when they were heavily damaged and should have retreated, instead rammed Veil cruisers at full speed. Not by accident, not in panic intentionally. The crews continued to transmit targeting data for the artillery of the ships behind them, calling out positions, talking to each other over open channels in calm voices until the very end. The Vale Combat Group won. Technically, the battle report indicated losses, and Zerkvel read it 3 times because the number seemed wrong. A third echelon combat group fighting a primitive defense fleet of that size should not have returned with such losses. He asked the tactical officer to recheck the figures. The figures were correct. He filed the report. He said nothing about it to his senior officers. He moved to the next phase of the campaign. But that night, standing at the forward observation deck, he opened the transmission records from the battle. He listened to the human ships talking to each other in their final minutes. He did not know their language well enough to understand most of it, but the translator gave him fragments. He listened to the crew of a dying ship speaking in calm, ordinary voices about firing angles and positions, while their hull fell apart around them, calling out positions, talking to each other over open channels in calm voices until the very end. He turned off the translator. He stood at the window for a long time. The prisoner was brought to him 2 days later. A Vale reconnaissance group conducting a ground landing on the northern continent had stumbled upon a small human military position and taken one captive. She was a woman, not young. The translator estimated her age somewhere between 35 and 45 years, which by human standards put her well into the middle of what should have been a comfortable life. She had 3 broken ribs. A wound on her arm that had been cauterized, they had properly treated it, and a pattern of metal shards in her face that would leave permanent scars. She was fully conscious. She looked at the reconnaissance group with that calm, cautious expression that a person has when they are counting them and thinking about the room. Sarek was interviewing her. Because Sarek was the fastest at learning their language, she went to the isolation cell with a translation device, a system for notes, and that particular anxiety that had gripped her ever since she opened the history file. The soldier asked for water. When Sarek brought it, the soldier said thank you correctly, formally. Not the automatic polite response of a person in shock, but the intentional, precise courtesy of a person who understood that how you treat the person in front of you matters, even when the situation around you is dire. She had learned to say thank you in Vale. In 48 hours from her capture, she had learned to say thank you in their language. Sarek sat across from her and looked at the woman, at the broken ribs, at the cauterized wound, at the metal in her face, and felt something for which she had no clean word, not pity, something closer to the feeling one gets when you look at something and realize you were wrong about it in a way that cannot be fixed by just knowing the correct answer. Does it hurt? Sarek asked, because she needed to start with something. The soldier looked at her, a small pause. Yes, she said. It hurts. You are not Sarek searched for the right word. You are not showing it. The soldier thought about this for a moment. Then she simply said, I know. Sarek opened her file. She had 30 questions prepared. Tactical questions, cultural questions, questions intended to fill the gaps in her intelligence picture. She got through 4 of them. Then the soldier asked her a question instead. How many of you have fought against your own people? Sarek stopped. Not for the last 800 years, she said. The soldier nodded, unsurprised, as if the answer was exactly as she had expected. That is the difference, the soldier said. That is all. Sarek wrote this in her file. She did not know what to do with it yet. She placed it in the anomalies folder, which by this point had become the largest folder in her system. She returned to her quarters, sat in the dark, and thought about what all these differences were worth. She had 3 reports to write, she had data to analyze, she had a picture of a species that was becoming clearer with every bit of information she added. Something she did not want to describe to her commander, she wrote the reports anyway. The Biological Weapons Department made its proposal 4 weeks into the campaign. The director came to Zerkvel with a professional face and a clean presentation. His department had developed a pathogen specifically designed for human biology. It targeted a key protein in their cellular replication. By all their models, it was a quick and effective solution. They had used a similar approach against the Corvi 7 years ago. The Corvi had not survived. Zerkvel approved the application. 3 days later, the pathogen was released in 3 target zones. The first reports were promising. The infection was spreading at the expected rate. Symptoms were manifesting on schedule. Part of the population was sick, moving toward the projected result. Then the reports changed. 3 weeks after the initial release, the spread of the pathogen slowed down. Then it stopped spreading so effectively. The infected population was developing protection, a biological counteragent, which, as the department director explained with a face that had lost some of its professionalism, should not have been possible at such speed. Zerkvel looked at the data. How fast? 3 weeks? He said for a pathogen they had been developing for 4 years, and those who were infected before the spread of protection. The director's face looked complicated. Some of them died, he said. The rest. He stopped. He looked at his data. The rest recovered and returned to their units. Zerkvel looked at him. They recovered from a lethal pathogen and returned to active combat? Yes, Commander. In what time frame? The director looked like a man who wished he were anywhere else. Days, he said. In several documented cases, within 48 hours after the fever passed, Sarek's anomalies folder now contained 612 separate entries. Late one night, she sat in her cabin and looked at the list. She had entries about prisoners, about battle reports, about biological weapon data, about 17 different specific incidents during ground engagements where human soldiers did things that had no category in standard tactical analysis. She had a long entry on their military history and an even longer entry on what happens to civilizations that lose, then rebuild, and then fight again. She had an entry she had written at 2 a.m. and then stared at for a long time before deciding to keep it. It read, "They were practicing for this, not specifically for us, for something like us. For 10,000 years, they have been preparing for exactly this type of war against something larger and better equipped than themselves. And they have been losing this war again and again within their own borders, and getting up and trying differently, and losing again and getting up again. And those who survived these wars survived because they were the ones who figured out how to fight when you are losing. We are not their first enemy. We are just the newest." She closed the folder. She went to the observation room because she couldn't sleep, and she needed to see something other than screens. She stood at the window and looked at the planet below. It was still lit. The lights on the dark side were still burning. The city she had seen vanish in the bombardment 3 weeks ago was the only dark spot. The others were still burning. She pressed her hand over to cold glass and looked at all those little lights. And she thought about a species that looked at 43 warships and responded in 40 minutes, and the general who chewed her pen and made notes in the margins of her own terms of surrender. She thought about the soldier who learned to say thank you in their language in 48 hours, who had broken ribs, a cauterized arm, and metal in her face, and who was counting heads when they entered the room, who said, "That is the difference. That is all." Sarek did not yet know what to do with the full weight of all this. She was still building the picture, but she was a good analyst. She could clearly see what the picture was becoming before it was finished. And the picture that was becoming clear to her in the long silence of the ship at night, with the planet below and its stubborn burning lights, was not a picture of a civilization that was going to bend. In the morning, she filed her next report. In the last section, she added a heading for the first time. Warnings, not conclusions. She sent it to Zerkvel and went to eat, trying not to think too much about whether anyone would listen to her. 6 months after the fleet's arrival, Zerkvel stopped dining in the command mess with his officers. He told them it was because of the schedule. It was not because of the schedule. It was because he had started to find the conversations unbearable in ways he couldn't explain without saying things he was not yet ready to say out loud. His officers were people he had served with for years, people who were good at their jobs, and they sat at the table every night and talked about the campaign in the language of people who still believed the campaign was going the way it was supposed to. He could no longer force himself to sit there and speak that language. The war had been going on for 6 months. By all the standards Zerkvel knew, a campaign against a civilization of such a technological level should have ended in 8 weeks, maximum 12, if the civilization in question was particularly stubborn at the beginning. The record for the duration of resistance by a non-Veil civilization against a Veil campaign was 4 months, and that species had had a planetary defense grid that had taken time to dismantle. Humans had no defense grid. They had no shields, no organized orbital platform, nothing that should have made this last for more than a few months. 6 months. They were still fighting. And what Zerkvel mulled over every night alone in his quarters was that they were getting better. The data was from Sarek. She brought it to him in a quiet meeting in his office. Just the two of them. With the door closed, she laid it out on his desk. Records of engagements. Month after month, 6 months of contact between Veil forces and human forces. She pointed to the trend. In the first month, Veil forces in ground engagements were winning about 80% of the time. In the second month, 73%. In the third month, 67%. In the fourth month, 60%. In the fifth month, 54%. She pointed to the sixth month, 49%. Zerkvel looked at it for a moment. "The forces we are deploying have not changed significantly," he said. No, Commander. The change is on their side. Yes. He looked at the trend. It was not a complicated mathematical picture. It was heading in one direction, steadily, at about the same speed each month. He was a man who had conducted 12 campaigns. He knew what trends did when left alone. How? He said. How are they improving at such a rate? Sarek had been waiting for this question. She feared it. Every engagement teaches them something, she said. They take their combat records, analyze them, then train according to what they learned, and then fight differently. They have been doing this to each other for 10,000 years. She paused. They are very good at learning to fight a specific enemy. They have adapted their tactics to us in 6 months, she said. Yes, and they have adapted their equipment. We have been tracking the production of their industrial facilities, and in the last 8 weeks, they have begun producing weapons designed with Veil armor specifications in mind. Not modified old weapons, but new designs created for us. Zerkvel looked at the data quietly. They are building weapons specifically designed to kill us, he said. Yes, Commander. In 6 months, they had existing industrial capacity, she said. And they have done this before, redirecting their entire production potential toward military manufacturing. They have done this twice in the last centuries against each other. They remember how. She looked at her hands for a moment. It seems this is something they know how to do by memory. A week later, news came from the biosecurity department. The pathogen had been defeated, not cured, defeated. The portion of the population it had infected had either died or recovered. And those who had recovered had passed the biological response to the pathogen through their population so effectively that it was now effectively neutralized. The department director presented his report with the look of a man who was no longer sure what he was doing. He included a footnote. The footnote read, "Several human medical facilities that were treating cases of pathogen infection continued to function without interruption throughout the period of infection. Medical personnel treated infected patients and then returned to treating combat wounds. In no observed facility was there any record of a post being abandoned." He did not add any comments to the footnote. Zerkvel read it and understood that no comment was needed. That same week, news came from the Galactic Council. There were 14 member species in the Council. In 300 years of Veil expansion, they had never interfered in a Veil campaign. They watched, they turned away, they calculated that turning away was easier than the alternative, and they lived with what it cost them. Quietly. It was an old agreement. Everyone understood it. The Council's message was not about interference, it was about observation. A ship. A Council observer had taken a neutral position over the Earth system 3 months after the start of the campaign. They were allowed. The Council had the legal right to observe any military action in explored space. Zerkvel had confirmed the ship's presence and ignored it. He had had observer ships before. They watched, they filed reports, they left. The message from this observer to the others, it was not addressed to the fleet command, but to the entire Council, and it was copied to Zerkvel's fleet, which was unusual. It said, "This species is not defending, it is building. What we are observing is not a civilization in its final stage. The engagement in the 6th month shows a force that has recalibrated itself to the opponent and is accelerating. The trajectory of this campaign has changed in a direction that I would recommend all Council members carefully note. We thought the battle cries were fear. It was the sound of a species remembering what it was born for." Zerkvel read this message twice. He did not know who on the ship the observer was who wrote it, but the line at the end had the quality of something that would be repeated for a long time. He felt its weight. He filed it. The engagement in the asteroid belt occurred in the 7th month. It should not have been a significant engagement. A Veil forward detachment, moving through the outer system, made contact with a human unit, using the dense debris field of the asteroid belt as cover. Standard doctrine dictated bypassing and cutting off their escape routes. The commander of the human unit made the standard decision. The human unit did not retreat. They used the debris field in a way that had no name in Veil doctrine. They used the asteroids themselves, large rocks pulled by small maneuvering thrusters along calculated trajectories, as weapons. They used the chaos of the field as protection, and they used it as a trap. And they held their position for 11 days. 11 days. Numerically outnumbered 4-1. Without supplies, without reinforcements, without any obvious path to survival that a Veil tactical officer analyzing the situation could find. On the 11th day, reinforcements arrived, and the human unit broke off the engagement. The reinforcements were not small. In the battle report, the commander of the forward detachment used words that Zerkvel had not read in a campaign report before. He used the word unrecognizable, which was a tactical term meaning that the enemy's behavior could not be categorized by existing doctrine. He used the word intentionally, which in this context did not mean unconsciously in the usual sense, but had a specific military meaning. The opponent had fully considered their situation and chosen a course of action without panic or confusion. The commander of the forward detachment also included what was not standard in battle reports. At the end, after the tactical analysis, he wrote one personal observation, which he did not explain or justify. He wrote, "I no longer know what they will not do." Zerkvel went to the forward observation deck the night the report on the asteroid belt arrived. He stood there for a long time. Below him, the planet was the same as always. Lights on the dark side, cloud cover moving slowly over the surface. 7 months of this. 7 months. Looking down at this planet and watching it not break, he thought about the campaign. He had gone through it just as he had gone through all his campaigns from the beginning. Arrival, ultimatum, bombardment, the silence after the bombardment, mobilization. Every step after that. He was not a man who lied to himself. He had built his career on the ability to see things clearly, to look at a situation without letting the shape of what he wanted it to be interfere with the shape of what it actually was. He had made hard decisions in 12 campaigns because he was prepared to see clearly. He saw clearly now. He thought about the trend on Sarek's graph, 49% in the 6th month. He didn't need to calculate where that line would go in the 12th month if nothing changed. He thought about the soldier with the broken ribs who learned to say thank you in his language in 48 hours. He thought about Sarek's note. They were practicing for this, and 10,000 years of war written in their history as a kind of long, terrible preparation for what was happening right now. He thought about the words of the forward detachment commander. "I no longer know what they will not do." He didn't know either. That was the truth with which he stood at the window. He had commanded 12 campaigns. He knew his own capabilities to the full extent. He knew what his forces could do, how far they could be pushed, and where their limits were. He had always known these things about the enemy, too, because all enemies were variations of the same type. Civilizations that were not built for war, that had other priorities and other focuses, and that hit a wall when they were pushed hard. The humans had no wall that he could find, or if there was one and he suspected there was, he had no idea where it was. He had no idea what it would take to find it. He had no idea. And that was what he stood with at the window. Could it still be found by his fleet's forces? He pressed his palm against the cold glass. Below, the lights were burning. Still burning. The 7th month of a campaign that should have ended in 8 weeks, and the lights were still burning, and the weapons factories were working. And somewhere in a room, on a ship or in a command post, General Amara Oi, who chewed her pen and made notes in the margins of her own terms of surrender, was probably looking at her own data. Zerkvel wondered what her trend looked like. He suspected he knew. He left the window. He went to his desk. He wrote 2 messages. One was to Fleet Command, marked with a classification level, meaning very few would read it. The other was to Sarek. The message to Fleet Command stated that the campaign was not developing according to the projected plan, and revised timelines were required. He wrote it in the careful, formal language of reports, which meant it said less than it intended. Fleet Command would read the careful language and understand what he was reporting to them. They would ask for more details. He would provide them. The message to Sarek was shorter. It read, "Keep the anomalies folder. I need everything that is in it." He sent both messages, then sat alone in the silence of his office and thought about 43 campaigns and what they had taught him, and what this one was teaching him that the others had not. He sat there for a long time. On Earth, in a command center on the west coast of the largest continent, General Amara Oi sat at a table with 6 of her senior officers and looked at the same trend in reverse. Their line was growing month after month. Their win percentage in direct engagements was increasing. Their losses per engagement were decreasing. Supply lines were holding. Factories were working at full capacity. The soldiers who survived the first months were training those who came after them. She looked at the data. She took the cap off her pen. She wrote 2 words in the margins of the engagement summary. She circled them. She did not say them out loud. There was no need to say them out loud. Everyone in the room saw the line. Everyone in the room was making the same quiet calculation. They had been here before. Not exactly here. Not this war, not this enemy, but its contours. A long beginning, a terrible price. a slow turn. When the turn finally came, they had been in such a form of war more than once, and they knew how it felt when the numbers started to move. They knew that feeling. OI looked at the trend one more time. She closed the pen, placed it on the table, and said to her officers in the direct, ordinary voice of a person who had finished waiting, "Begin developing the next phase." The Vale Peace Ambassador arrived 14 months after the fleet's arrival. Her name was Vilmara. Over her career, she had conducted 17 surrender negotiations for the Vale Dominion in 14 different systems. She was very good at her job. She wore her experience in the smooth, professional manner of a person who had sat in difficult rooms many times and never left without getting what she came for. She already had a draft treaty ready before she boarded the ship. She had written it the way she always wrote these things, a document that looked like a negotiation but was in fact a more comfortable form of the initial terms. The losing side would get the feeling that they had fought for something and gained something. The winning side would get everything they came for. Everyone would leave with their dignity roughly intact. This was the art of what she did, and she was proud of it, and she had never had a reason not to be. On the way to the neutral station, she read the campaign data, all 14 months of it. She read it with the disciplined eye of a person who had read many campaign data and understood them as background text, context that told you how resilient the other side was, and therefore how big a gesture of magnanimity should be made when you sat down with them. She read the first 3 months and made notes. She read from the 4th to the 8th month and stopped making notes. From the 9th to the 14th month, she read very carefully, sitting very quietly, and wrote nothing down. When she arrived at the neutral station and stepped off the ship, and the assistant meeting her asked if she needed anything before the summit started, she said she needed an hour alone. That hour she spent reading the data again. The meeting room was on the 3rd level of the neutral station, a simple space with a long table, 2 sets of chairs, and a view through a wide window of the planet below and the scattered remains of what had been Vale forward positions around it. The debris caught the light and created small bright dots in the darkness, which, in Mara's opinion when she entered, was a very unsettling reminder of how the last 14 months had gone. She chose her seat, she laid out her documents, folded her hands, and the human delegation arrived. Among them was one person, a woman, not young, in a dark suit and comfortable shoes, without a military escort, without ceremonial armor, without any displays. She entered just the way one enters a meeting they have held 100 times and consider mostly tedious. She looked at the room and sat down opposite Mara. She placed a small bag on the floor next to her chair. She poured water into both glasses. Then she looked at Vilmara and said, "Thank you for coming," with an accent, but correctly in Vale. Vilmara studied her Yara Chen. The file said she had been a diplomat for 23 years. The file also said that before that, she had worked for 4 years as a field medic, which was an unusual combination that Vilmara read twice. "Thank you for the invitation," Bela said carefully. "I hope the station is comfortable. We had little time for preparation." Chen looked at the table, then at Vilmara. She had the manner of a person who was genuinely trying to make the situation as easy as possible for the person opposite her, which in the circumstances disoriented Mara. "I understand you traveled for some time." "Yes," said Mara. "A long journey," said Chen. "Yes. Do you need anything before starting?" "We brought." Chen took a thermos out of the small bag and set it on the table. "I didn't know what you would prefer to drink, so I brought an extra one that I have. It's coffee. You have probably encountered it." She paused. "It is an acquired taste." Mara looked at the thermos. She looked at the human woman who had obviously brought a warm drink to a peace summit at the end of a war her species had just won. "Thank you," she said. "You are most welcome," said Chen and slid the folder across the table. Vilmara opened the folder. She had her draft treaty at hand, ready. She expected to receive a counterproposal to the initial terms of submission or a list of initial requirements that she would steer toward something manageable. She expected the folder to be the start of the negotiation. This was not the start of a negotiation. It was a completed document. The terms were fully written, ready for signing. She read the title page, turned to the first section, read slowly, then returned to the beginning and read again. The terms required the Vale Dominion to pay reparations for the destruction of the coastal city and for all other damage caused during the 14-month campaign. The reparations were large, but not ruinous. They were calculated. She saw that the figures corresponded to the actual damage, not to what they could have demanded. The terms required the withdrawal of all Vale forces from the Earth system within 60 days. The terms included a demilitarized zone of a certain size around the Earth star system, which would be monitored by a galactic council observer. There was a section long, detailed, with many subsections requiring the Veiled Dominion to hand over complete cultural and historical records of all the civilizations they had subjugated, all 47 of them, their languages, their history, their art, what remained of them. This section was the longest part of the document. Vilmara read everything. Then she sat with the document in her hands and looked at the table in front of her for a moment. She was looking for the part that was not there. There was no annexation of Veil territories, no requirement for political control, no disbanding of the army, no tribute, no advisory roles without real power, none of the things that had been in the initial terms, things that she assumed would simply be returned to the Veil, since defeated powers were always returned a version of what they had tried to do to others. It was not there. She looked at Yara Chen. Chen was drinking her coffee. She was holding the cup with both hands. She was looking at Vilmara with that calm, patient expression of a person who knows they have handed someone something complex and is giving them enough time. "You won," said Mara. The words came out very simply, not diplomatically, just the truth. "You pushed us back. Data from the engagements. You know what they show? You could have taken territory. You could have demanded the disbanding of our army. You could have written these terms the way we wrote ours." She looked at the document. "Why didn't you?" Chen set her coffee down. She was silent for a moment. She turned the cup in her hands once, then set it down flat on the table. "Because we know what unreasonable costs are worth," she said. Vilmara waited for a continuation. There was nothing more. "That is not a complete answer," she said. "It is an honest answer," Chen said. "We have been on the other side of terms like yours before, not with you, but with ourselves. We wrote surrender documents to each other. We lived under them. We know what civilizations turn into under such terms." And after a silence, she looked at the folder on the table between them. "We are not interested in turning the Veil into that. You would prefer a functional Veil Dominion. I would prefer a Veil Dominion that has no reason to return." Vilmara looked at her. "That is strategic," she said. "Yes," said Chen. "And it is also correct. It is fundamentally correct." There was a pause. "The section on cultural records," said Vilmara, turning the page. 47 civilizations. Yes, some of these records, the more complete ones, are classified as military access. Their release will require review by the Council. It will be, not a simple process. "I know," said Chen. "We have budgeted 5 years for this. There is a schedule in Appendix 3. She paused. These people existed. Their languages, their histories, something of them must be preserved somewhere outside of military archives. Vilmara looked at Appendix 3. Indeed, there was a schedule. It was detailed. It had been written by someone who had thought about this problem for a long time. She placed the document on the table. She had 17 negotiations behind her. She had a draft treaty at her side that was now irrelevant. She sat opposite a human woman who had brought coffee to a peace summit and had obviously spent part of the last 14 months thinking about the preservation of the cultures erased by the Veil, and she felt something for which she did not immediately have a name. "I need to contact Fleet Command," she said. "These terms need consideration at the command level before I can sign." "Of course," said Chen. She made a small gesture toward the room. "Take as much time as you need. I will be here." Vilmara went to a separate room on the upper level of the station and opened a secure channel to Fleet Command. Zerkvel's face appeared on the screen. He looked, she thought, like a man who had not slept well for months. His eyes were calm, but there were shadows under them, and he held himself with that particular controlled calmness of a person who is dealing with a great deal. She laid out a summary of the terms for him. He listened without saying a word. When she finished, he was silent. She asked about the 47 civilizations. "Yes, Commander," he said. Another pause. "Tell me, what is your opinion of her?" Vilmara thought about it. "She brought coffee," she finally said. There was a long pause on the channel. "Sign the treaty," said Zerkvel. They signed it 4 hours later. Mara's assistant prepared the official copies. Chen's small team, there were 3 people with her, checked the language. The process was quiet and organized. The 2 of them signed the human copy, then the Veil copy, and then the copy for the Council Observer that would go to the Council archives. When everything was done, Vilmara sat for a moment with the signed document before her. She thought about the 17 negotiations, how all of them had their form, the posturing at the beginning, the moments when both sides tested each other, the point when the outcome was clear and the work came down to management, to how it was framed. She had been good at this work. She was proud of it. This did not have that form. This was a woman who put a completed document on the table, poured water for both parties, and waited. "Why a medic?" asked Vilmara. She was not sure where the question came from. It had been sitting in her head since she read the file on the way here. "Before diplomacy, you were a field medic." Chen looked slightly surprised that she knew. Then she stopped being surprised. "Yes," she said. "It is an unusual path." "Maybe," said Chen, "and maybe not. You spend enough time dealing with the consequences of failure." She stopped. She looked at the signed document on the table. "You start becoming very motivated to fix things sooner." Vilmara looked at her for a moment. "I have a question," she said, "and I am asking it as a person, not as a negotiator." "Good. When you read our initial terms, the terms of submission that we delivered at the beginning, what did you write in the margins?" Chen froze for a moment. The question surprised her not uncomfortably, but rather the way a question surprises when it is the right one. She thought for a moment. Sincerely thought, like a person returning to a memory. "The notes were mainly about Clause 14, she said. "I wanted to understand the logic of it, what it assumed about how civilizations work." She paused. "And at the end, I wrote a question." "What was that question?" Chen looked out the window at the debris outside, catching the light. "I wrote, 'Do they know what they are starting?'" She paused for a moment. I hoped the answer would be no, that it was an information error, that they didn't understand who we were. She looked at Vilmara again. "I hoped that for a long time." Vilmara said nothing. "In any case," said Chen, and began gathering her copies of the document. "Now it is done." "Yes," said Vilmara. "Done." Outside the window, the debris caught the light and created its small, cold points in the darkness. And the planet below rotated slowly. And the war was over. 20 years is a long time. It is enough for a war to become history. Enough for history to become something that is taught in schools, argued about by researchers, and eventually reduced to 1 or 2 sentences in books covering many centuries in a single volume. Enough for the people who survived it, to grow old enough that the younger ones begin to see them differently, not as people who made decisions, but as figures belonging to a past that seems very distant. 20 years is enough for everything to change. In the Galactic Council, there were now 15 member species. Earth did not occupy a standard seat. The Council spent 8 months debating what seat Earth should occupy, because existing categories did not fit well. Full membership implied equal status among all Council species, which was technically accurate but practically complicated. Earth had already demonstrated that it occupied a different position than the others, in ways that were hard to fit into the existing structure. Observer status implied passivity, which was so clearly incorrect that the vote on that option lasted 4 minutes before it was rejected. In the end, they created a new category. The word for it in the formal language of the Council translated roughly as Guarantor, a species that had no territorial claims in the Council's jurisdiction, did not seek tribute or political control from any member, and whose role was simply to ensure compliance with Council agreements. No one asked what would happen if they were not complied with. No one needed to. Dr. Marcus Webb had an office on the Council station with a window looking out onto the star field on the quiet side of the station, away from the docks and the traffic. He loved it because it was almost always quiet. In his 12 years of working on the station, first as a junior liaison and now as a senior representative of Earth, he had done most of his best thinking in this silence. He was sitting at his desk on a Tuesday morning, sorting out a trade dispute between 2 council members that had dragged on for 6 weeks, when a knock came at the open door. He looked up. The Vale diplomat was young 23, maybe 24 years old, which by Vale standards put him firmly at the start of his career. He had a sharp, cautious face and a posture that said he was trying to look more confident than he felt. He carried a data tablet and wore formal diplomatic colors that on a young diplomat always looked a bit too big, like formal clothing when you haven't grown into what it represents. His name was Srain. Webb had met him 6 months ago when Srain was assigned to the Council station. He had a reputation for asking questions that his superiors tended to find inconvenient. "Dr. Webb, do you have a few minutes?" he said. Webb pointed to the chair opposite his desk. "Sit down," he said. Srain sat. He placed the data tablet on his knee. He did not look at it. He had the look of a person who had been mulling over a conversation for some time and had come to conduct it. Webb waited. "I have been reading the history of the war," Srain said. "Good," said Webb. "The full archive, not the summary. The engagement records, the intelligence files, the negotiation transcripts." He paused. Ambassador Chen's notes from the treaty session. She has good notes, said Webb. She has very detailed notes. Srain was silent for a moment. The terms she proposed. I have read them many times. I have been trying to find. I was looking for strategic logic. He looked at Webb. We did not deserve those terms. Webb leaned back in his chair. No, he said. You didn't. Then why? Asked Srain. Not the neutrality of a diplomat, but a genuine question from a person who had sat with this and could not resolve it alone. You won. The terms you offered us. You could have taken territory. You could have done to us what you did to the other 47 civilizations. The math added up. The math added up, Webb agreed. So why didn't you? Webb looked out the window. The star field, still and dark and very large. He had been asked variations of this question before by journalists, researchers, other council members who had their reasons to understand it. He had different answers for different contexts. The strategic one, which Yara Chen had given Mara in the meeting room, unreasonable terms create reasons for return. The political one, Earth needed allies, not subjects. The historical one, this had already been tried differently, and the result was recorded. He did not give Srain any of these answers. He thought about the 3 wars in which he had served before becoming a diplomat. He thought about the field hospital in the dark, its particular silence when the firing stopped and there was only the work of whoever would follow. He thought about what you understand about the price when you watch it up close for years. What you understand about what is worth it and what is not. Someone had to, he said. Srain looked at him. That is not an answer. It is the only one I have, and it is right. That is not. Srain stopped. He looked at the data tablet on his knee. He carefully placed it on the table and looked at it, then looked back at Webb. We killed 1.5 million people in 4 minutes at the beginning. We used biological weapons. We did these things. And in the end, you offered us terms that allowed us to function, allowed us to keep our government, our military structure, our territory. You asked for money and cultural records. He shook his head slightly. How can a person make such a decision? Badly, Webb said slowly, with a lot of arguments. He looked at Srain. There were people who wanted other terms. There were people who said the math adds up and we should use it. They were not wrong about the math. He paused, and Amara Oi argued for what we did instead. She was in the room when it mattered, and she argued for it. What did she say? Webb thought. She said, we are not going to do to you what you did to others, and then live with who we become if we do it. He paused, and then she said something I have thought about a lot. She said, we cannot decide whether mercy is worth giving after deciding whether we want to give it. We have to decide that we are the kind of people who give it before the question arises. Otherwise, it is not mercy. It is just a strategy with a better name. Srain was silent. The Veiled Dominion, he said after a moment, is different now from what it was 20 years ago. I know, said Webb. The species we conquered, some of those who survived. We made contact with them as part of the cultural records process. Some of them have opened communication. He stopped. He looked at his hands. It is complicated. It is a very complicated set of conversations, but they are happening. I know, Webb said again. Partly. I think partly because the terms, because we remained functional enough to deal with that. He looked at Webb. I have thought about this a lot. I imagine you have. I wanted to tell you. Srain said this less formally than everything else he had said. More directly. I wanted to tell someone who was there, who was involved in this, that it mattered, that things changed because of the choice that was made. Webb looked at him for a long time. I will tell Oi, he said. She will want to hear it. Srain nodded. He picked up his data tablet. He stood up. He was at the door when he turned back, and for a moment, he was not a young diplomat trying to look confident, but just a young man standing in the doorway. Do you think it was worth it? He asked. The war? How much it cost for the result that came out of it? Webb thought about it for a moment. He thought about the real answer, the honest one. I think the war was a catastrophe, he said. I think 1.5 million people died in 4 minutes, and that event should not have happened. I think we lost people we should not have lost. And we did things in those 14 months that we will be arguing about for a very long time. He paused. And I think that what happened after, what you are describing, is real. Both of these things are true at the same time. I had to learn to hold both. Srain nodded. He left. Webb sat with his star field and his trade dispute documents and the silence of the station on the quiet side, and thought about Amara Oi, who was now retired and lived somewhere on the East Coast, and sent him photographs of her garden sometimes, and about Yara Chen, who was now also on Earth, consulting with the particular busy and retired atmosphere of people who don't know how to stop working, and about Sarek, who had become one of the most cited analysts in the Council's history, and who once told him that the anomalies folder was still the organizational structure she used for everything she did not have a category for yet. He returned to the trade dispute. The alarm came 3 weeks later. It arrived during a full session of the Council. 14 species, plus the Earth delegation, seated around the circular hall in their sections in the middle of a discussion on navigation rights in a sector that 3 of them shared. The alarm was marked by the Council's Outer System Observation Network, and it appeared simultaneously on the displays of every member. A new hyperspace signature, originating from a system approximately 40 light-years from the Council's outer boundary, an unknown species. They had achieved hyperlight travel in the last few years. They had found the Council's communication network and had sent an aggressive probe as their first message into that network, a signal, a declaration of territory, a challenge, the type of message a species sends when it wants to establish very early that it is not afraid of anything it might find. The Council chamber fell silent, not out of surprise, but out of recognition. Every species in this room had a history. Some of these histories included the moment of first contact, the calculation of what is out there and whether it is worth fearing. Some of these histories included what happened when the calculation went wrong. They all read the signal. No one spoke. On the Council display, the signal from the new system was playing. By any technical measure, it was clear and intentional. A species that was young and had just discovered the stars and decided in this first loud moment to assert itself before anyone else could. Webb looked at the signal for a long time. He thought about the 43 ships that appeared above the blue planet. He thought about the 6 hours that became 40 minutes. He thought about the general with the chewed pen, writing in the margins. He thought about all the things this new species did not yet know, about what was here, and about the 47 civilizations in the Council archives whose histories were slowly, carefully being reconstructed, and about the coastal city that was no longer there. He thought about how much it costs to learn. The Veil ambassador stood up. He was older than when Webb first met him. Zerkvel had retired long ago, and the ambassador was now a different person, younger, who had risen through the changed dominion that the last 2 decades had built. But he had read the archive. He had read everything. He stood up and looked through the camera at Marcus Webb. The room was very quiet. "Should we inform them?" said the Veil ambassador. Webb looked at the signal on the display again, at the aggressive tone, at the coordinates of the system that had sent it, at all the confidence in it, the loud confidence of the first breath of a species that had just opened a door and decided to walk through it as if it owned the hallway. He knew how it was. He had been on the other side of this. "Send them our full diplomatic package," he said. He paused for a moment and marked the map of the asteroid belt at Proxima Centauri's second body. The Veil ambassador looked at him. In his expression, something changed, something that was not quite a smile and not quite grief, but sat in the gap between them. He nodded. The Council communications officer began composing the messages. Around the camera, 14 species sat with the particular weight of people who had learned something at the cost of significant effort and were now watching someone else about to start the same lesson. There was nothing comfortable in that weight. There was nothing satisfying in it. It was just a thing you carry. When you have been somewhere and you know the road, Webb looked at the star field through the camera's far window. There, 40 light-years away, a species that did not yet know what it had started was waiting to see what would answer their signal. Something would answer something patient, experienced, and not malicious. Over time, they would learn what they had started. And then if everything went as Webb hoped, if the choice was made correctly when it had to be made, they would learn something else, something more difficult to learn, something that would last longer. He looked at the display where their signal was still playing, and thought about the garden on the East Coast and the old general who now grew tomatoes and sent him photos, and about all the things that were possible on the other side of war if you were willing to choose them. The message was sent. The stars were very still. The work continued.